Let us remember that we are in the holy presence of God. I am a part of all that I have met, yet all experience is an arch wherethrough gleams that untraveled world whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. How dull it is to pause, to make an end, to rust unburnished, not to shine in use, as though to breathe were life. That's from Tennyson and from Katrina Meyer. A book is a magical thing that lets you travel to faraway places without ever leaving your chair. St. John Baptist de La Salle, pray for us. Live Jesus in our hearts forever. So today we're starting the personality disorders. These are unusual in that it is the core part of who you are, as opposed to just ego-syntonic disorders, where you feel as though your disorder has become a part of your core person. In the personality disorders, by definition, these are a core part of who you are. So that's different from ego-syntonic disorders. And as a result, in DSM-3 and 4, the personality disorders were removed from Axis 1, the clinical syndromes, and moved into a new axis, Axis 2, which was for the personality disorders and mental retardation, because these play out very differently from others. John Morley's quote from a century ago, "No man can climb out beyond the limitations of his own character," really gets at this issue that our personalities are who we are. So if you go back to that elementary school exercise of what are 3 words that you could use to describe you to someone who has no experience with your culture or your history, those were really getting at personality. So if you come up with 3 words that characterize you and your ways of interacting with the world and with others around you, and if we ask other people to do the same thing, we get at your personality. For me, I would use terms like caring, creative, intelligent, and that would get us at some of the issues that you'll see as we look at personality. So personality, by definition, is all of the ways we have of acting, thinking, believing, and feeling, and that is fairly stable. Obviously, I need to plug in my computer. For decades, psychology struggled with how many of those traits we needed to have in order to define individuals uniquely. And 2 independent labs, in reviewing all of the literature available, came to the same answer after decades of work, and an answer that's been supported repeatedly. And that is 5, the big 5 that you learned in general psychology. So McCrae and Costa discovered this, as did Lou Goldberg, at the same time. So the big 5, as you should remember: neuroticism. If you're high on neuroticism, you can be described as nervous, high-strung, perhaps as fearful. And if you're at the extreme low end of neuroticism, you can be described as calm, relaxed, optimistic. There are positive and negative descriptors for wherever you are on here. And the reality is, for each of the 5, while there are 2 extreme ends, most of us are not at the extreme end on all 5. In fact, most of us are at an extreme on 1 or 2, and somewhere in the middle on the others. So that's neuroticism. Agreeableness, people high in A are described as agreeable. They might be gullible. They're often giving. And people very low on agreeableness are often described as disagreeable. They might be described as selfish, and they might be described as tough. People high in extroversion. This is different than the way it gets used in popular press. So people high in extroversion are described as extroverted, though we often misuse that term, as sociable, sometimes as dominant, while people very low in extroversion are described as introverted. They might be described as aloof or as constricted. And I do want to stress that the definition of extroversion we use in psychology is not outgoing, and introversion is not shy. Those traits are correlated with introversion and extroversion, but they are not the same thing. So introversion and extroversion have to do with how much energy you either give or get in social situations. Easiest way to know if someone is high in E or very low in E is if you look at two people. We have these two people. They both really want to go to a party. So they go to a large party. Both people have a really good time at the party. The person high in E will leave that party feeling energized, having more energy than when they got there because they get energy from interacting with other people. While the person who is very, very low in E will leave that party feeling drained, wanting to go spend time alone, not sleeping, but spending time alone, recharging. Because the person who is an introvert or very low in E is giving a lot of energy in being in social situations, while the high E gets energy from those situations. All right, then we have conscientiousness. Person high in C is conscientious, might be described as perfectionistic. The person who is very low in C might be described as aimless, as very casual, or as hedonistic. And finally, openness to experience. The person high in O is described as unconventional, creative, perhaps a dreamer. And the person who is very low in O may be described as rigid, as very practical, liking routine, and perhaps as constricted with respect to new experiences. So you ought to recognize the acronym here of OCEAN. Remember the acronym and remember what each of these stands for. So on an exam, if you remember that it's OCEAN, but you come up with something else for the N or the A or any of these, you don't get full credit just for remembering OCEAN. You need to remember that the N is neuroticism and what that means and all of the others. All right, so if personality is all of the ways we have of acting, thinking, and believing and feeling, that's marked by the big five. What are the personality disorders? What does it mean to have a disorder that is your personality? What it means is that you have long-standing patterns of acting, thinking, believing, and feeling. So long-standing patterns that are maladaptive for you or for the people around you. So for some of the personality disorders, people are not in the least bit bothered by their long-standing patterns, but it is damaging or disruptive for the people around them. And for others, it's the individual where this creates serious difficulties. Now, in the DSM-5, it took 20 years for the revision from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5. And that was because the personality disorders were supposed to be radically transformed so that diagnosis would reflect the way disorders exist rather than the way that we've set them up in these discrete categories, but would reflect the fact that all of the symptoms and all of the disorders exist along continua. So in the DSM-5, while we didn't quite get as far as the radical transformation we tried for, we did get to a structure or scaffolding for a new system. So the DSM-5 task force and the American Psychiatric Association are asking all clinicians to use the new criteria and then use the old criteria. So in the new system, we first look at whether or not a personality disorder exists. is there an enduring pattern, so most of your life, of inner experiences and behaviors that deviate markedly from the expectations of your culture? If there is, we'll see it in 2 or more areas: the way that you think, the way that you experience emotion, the way that you interact with other people, and impulse control. If you have this enduring pattern, if you don't have this reflected in at least 2 of those areas, then we say, no, you don't have a general personality disorder and we should not diagnose one. But if you do, then we move on to B. Is this enduring pattern, so this thing that's been there pretty much all of your life, is it inflexible? Are you not capable of responding differently? And is it pervasive? Is it the way you are, not just in all social situations, but in all situations? If yes to both of these, then does the enduring pattern lead to clinically significant distress or impairment? Is the pattern stable and of long duration? Which sounds a lot like B. And then the rule out, it's not a manifestation or consequence of another disorder, and it's not attributable to substances or other medical conditions. So if we pass that, so we end up with a yes, then this part is truly the radical change. Then we rate you on, first, on a 0 to 4 scale, on elements of personality functioning. So we rate you on the self, your sense of identity and self-direction, and we rate you on interpersonal functioning. Do you experience empathy for others? Can you experience an intimate relationship? And after we rate you on those, then we rate you on 5 broad trait dimensions and 25 facets of those total domains. And we end up from all of those ratings, then moving on to looking at which disorder you have.